Welcome back to United in Strengths, this VIA Institute initiative that really tries to focus on a couple different things here. To remember that we have 24 character strengths to turn to pause during the day just to breathe, and to also connect, and to connect with one another in this community, to connect with people outside of this community, and to really make that more of our default in our life of connecting with people. And today's session is going to be very much about that too. And so let's just dive in here. I'm very honored and excited, elated to introduce my colleague and my friend, Adam Clark. And I'll just say a few things about Adam. So he's Associate Professor of Theology at Xavier University, which is here in Cincinnati. And he's a very distinguished teacher, actually. He received a Teacher of the Year nomination by International Honor Society. He's received the Faculty Support Award by the Black Student Association. Has a number of different courses that he does. Here's just a few of him that he's in, a few different courses he's into now, which is Black Theology, Jesus and Power, Faith and Justice, Religion and Hip Hop, and really digging also into the contributions of Jesuit practice in educating students. So that's a lot of the work of the exercises with St. Ignatius. He serves as a co-chair of Black Theology Group at the American Academy of Religion. And he's done a number of publications in the area of Black theology and Black religion. He participates in a number of different social justice groups in the Cincinnati area. And we also wanted to point out he has a new podcast and course. Well, he's going to be personally offering his own podcast next year, but also he's part of the second most downloaded religious podcast in the United States, and that's called Homegrown Christianity. And so he's been a guest on that podcast a number of times, and actually he has a class and a reading group that he's been leading for Homegrown Christianity on Black theology. So you might do a Google search on Adam Clark and Black theology, and you'll find all sorts of good stuff, including those podcasts. And Adam and I have connected for a number of different years, and we've always talked about doing different things around looking at the character strengths and ancient wisdom figures, different spiritual figures, and philosophers, religious leaders, their character strengths, and how that can teach us about modern day happenings in our life. So here we get to really dig into a more modern day figure in Martin Luther King Jr. And so I'm very happy to turn it over to you, Adam, to just dig a little bit into or a lot into King and his life and his work. And also I know a big part of this work is also what King called beloved community, and how that is actually a modern day experience and what we can do to tap into that. So would love to turn it to you and hear some of your thoughts here.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm so happy to be here and happy to be on this platform and talking to all of you guys domestically and around the world. I titled this session, Sacred Activism, Living into Beloved Community. Sacred Activism, Living into Beloved Community. I do a course on Martin Luther King, at Xavier University. And I think that his legacy is more relevant now than it's been in a long time because of the divisive nature of what's happening in our country. And I think it can be used as a resource to try to repair some of the divides that have been breached, and really try to revision American possibility, even global possibility once again. And one of the things I wanted to kind of raise tonight is the question that I think that we need to focus on is, how do you live into beloved community? And when I talk about living into beloved community, I'm referring to, what should we think? What are the modes of being in action for us to create the beloved community that we want and deserve? Sacred activism is really trying to fuse spiritual truth with radical action. It comes at the nexus of spirituality and social change, the mystical prophetic. And I should mention that I'm a professor of theology at Xavier University. So I come out of the religious tradition. And one of the dangers of religion is always about what we call spiritual bypass, right? That we become so spiritual in our thinking that we avoid the very concreteness and maybe evil and wrongdoing in everyday life, right? Because human beings are both transcendent creatures and historical creatures. And religious thinkers tend to always focus on the transcendent and sometimes ignore the historical nature, the embodied and material nature of our being. So one of the questions we have to ask if we're looking at beloved community is, to what degree can human beings or societies fulfill themselves in the context of history? Because we accept that we have spirits and souls, but can we fully realize them in the context of our history? That's been the problem. For example, if you see a child with a bloated belly, right, it doesn't do us any good to talk to him about his inner soul. The spiritual act is feeding the child, right? That's a spiritual act. And sometimes religious communities tend to lose sight of that. But I like to use King of Reliant King because he's one of the most important figures in US and global history, and his impact. And when I teach King, I teach, three dimensions of King. First, the popular king. The popular king is the king that we find in our national celebrations, right? And for the popular king, it's always strange because you have political figures that are deeply opposed to King always celebrated him each January. For example, last January, you have figures like Donald Trump and Ted Cruz give speeches supportive of the King legacy. And you'd also have Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton give speeches supportive of King. And one has to wonder, are they identifying with the same King, right? How is it that people on the evangelical right, such as Franklin Graham and Ralph Reed and Jerry Falwell Jr., publicly identify with the King legacy, but so do people like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and William Barber, right? How do the Tea Party, conservative Tea Party members identify with King, and the Black Lives Matter members claim King? If these people are so opposed to each other, how can everybody claim King? Can everybody be equally right? That's been a question of mine. So the image that's been constructed of King makes everyone happy. Even the people that oppose his policies and practices that he supported are comfortable to do that. And I say that's the popular king. That's the king of popular culture. What I teach in my class is what I call the historical king. The historical king is who King was in history, not the popular king of the celebration, but who King was in history. When you think about King, you would think about someone who dies of natural causes, the way people talk about him. But he was murdered, right? And that makes a difference. During the course of his life, which publicly only lasted 12 years, right? He was stabbed once in the chest. His home was bombed 3 times. The Daily Mail brought a steady flow of death threats and obscenities. He was called an extremist, a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker. Even the president of Morehouse didn't honor him because they said he went to jail too much, right? And when he finally did get killed, he died at the age of 39, but when they opened his body, he had the heart of a 60-year-old. He had so much stress in his life. He burned the candle on both ends, working 20-hour days, and gave 450 speeches a year, right? That's the king that I teach in my class. Who was that king and why was he deemed so threatening during his life, but more heroic after his life? And then the third king is the living king, right? So we have the popular king, the historical king, and the living king. And what I call the living king is, how do we use King's legacy to create a new future? All the people that were inspired by his movement and used his life and his legacy for their purposes. For example, the labor movement got rejuvenated through the King movement. The feminist movement started to get advances. the ecological justice, the LGBTQ movement. All of these movements were inspired by their participation in solidarity with civil rights workers, right? So the King movement just wasn't a group trying to struggle for their own individual rights, but they became a unit or a group of transformation to transform the very nature of American democracy. And that's the real key. When I ask most of my students about why King was important, they usually say, well, because he gave civil rights for Blacks. And as important as that is, right, it doesn't exhaust what King did. King was about restructuring American democracy, right? The guiding principle of the King movement was equal votes for equal souls, right? That spiritual equality ought to equal social equality. We agree that people are spiritually equal, but that should be translated into social equality. And what what he actually did was transform America, especially the South. Those of you who are listening, who are sports fans, right? Especially college sports fans, right? Can you imagine what Alabama football, Clemson football, Oklahoma would look like without Black athletes? Well, during King's time, there were no Black athletes, there were no Black people at these Southern universities, right? After the King movement, they started allowing Blacks to enter into these universities in large numbers, right? What about Duke basketball or North Carolina basketball? There are no professional sports teams in the segregated South. No Atlanta Braves, no Dallas Cowboys, no Atlanta Falcons. No Olympics could be in the South during segregation. There were no majority leaders of the Senate. Women couldn't serve on juries. There were no female rabbis until the 1970s or female Episcopal priests, no bilingual voting, no disabilities acts, no youth vote. So King's influence extended beyond the Black vote. It reconstituted America, and most dramatically the South, right? So what King tried to do in terms of his public life was point out the gap between the American ideal and American reality. America claims freedom, justice, and equality, but the reality was far different. And what King did was to say, America must be true to her own commitments, right? And that's where the King movement comes. Now, what does that mean for today? Those of you who are, on this Zoom, are familiar with character strengths. And right before, I got on the Zoom today, I tried to, I did the survey about King's character strengths. And I don't know if I want to actually announce what I got or have them guess about what King's top character strengths are.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, maybe let's have people guess. And right now, just go ahead right now in the chat. I think it's enabled, right, Ruth? And just guess what you think the highest character strengths are of the 24 for Martin Luther King Jr. And you can name 1, 2, or 3. And while you're doing that, I just want to mention that what Adam did was because he's a scholar on King, he knows King is, top 1% of 1% of people on this planet. So he knows King really, really well. So he went in and took the VIA survey as if he was MLK, which is a really fascinating approach. And VIA's thought about and made progress on doing that with a number of historical figures. But we've never had someone do it on behalf of MLK. So it's really, really quite extraordinary. So we definitely want to hear the results, Adam, and I know you've already shared them with me. But let's take a look at what others are saying here. And as you could see as well, there's a ton of responses. So perseverance and leadership, bravery, spirituality, leadership, justice, fairness, perseverance, love, justice being fairness again, judgment, prudence, perspective, humility, leadership, fairness, resilience, which could be probably translated as perseverance, fairness, bravery, humility, kindness, fairness. We can see a pattern here: social intelligence, spirituality, perspective, zest, bravery, courage, love, resilience. And I won't keep going. You can see a lot of different patterns, but also you can see many of the 24 represented. I wonder if, certainly the majority of the strengths are represented.
Right.
What were your results, Adam, taking the VIA survey as if you were Martin Luther King Jr.?
Well, yes. Again, if I was Martin Luther King Jr., so I'm doing the best as being an interpreter, but my results were first, gratitude; second, judgment; third, leadership; fourth, honesty; and spirituality. And I was trying to actually take it as the historical king around 1956 to 1960. This is actually even pre-March on Washington, it's 1963. So I was trying to inhabit the mindset of him. And, it was difficult. It was difficult. Like, I don't know exactly how much he appreciated beauty. There's not a whole lot about that, in terms of that. So there's some type of interpretive work going. But that's the best to my knowledge in terms of reading King for, a couple decades, I would say.
Yeah, and it seemed like people were getting, they were aligned with the leadership piece, one of the signature strengths you found, and then spirituality as well. But what do you make of gratitude being the number one when you took it? Not many people spotted that one.
Right.
A couple people did, but what do you make of that?
I was a bit surprised, but when I think about gratitude as like a virtue, is the virtue of transcendence, right?
Yeah.
Being aware and thankful that good things happen, right? And I think, at least in terms of his personal conduct, that, and I'm trying to think of concrete examples that I could kind of share with everybody, and I'm kind of running a blank, but he was a person who was an overachiever. King went to college at the age of 16. He went to Morehouse College, which is a historically Black college, at the age of 16. He graduated when he was about 20, then went to graduate school at the age of 20, was one of the first Blacks to enter into Crozer Theological Seminary at the age of 20, and overachieved there, and then went on to get his PhD. He was actually living, especially for his time, a pretty elite life. And he had a deep appreciation from coming from segregation in the South and coming up north, that I think, like, in terms of the arc of his life, he never could anticipate, no one can, the type of life he was about to have as a public person. He thought he wanted to be a professor, and he was training to do this, and he loved books. He loved learning. He loved writing papers. Matter of fact, he was so caught up in the sweep of history that there were many times, and his personal friends will tell you, that he wanted to just quit the movement. It was hard on him. It was hard on his family. They were trying to assassinate him all the time. And it was so stressful that he probably, if he could, get out of this, but he was caught in the grip of history. So I think the gratitude comes in terms of just the training, and also the point of history that I was actually looking at, right? I think if I probably looked at it later in his life, there might be some, a different set of values, because I think he went into despair. And I think he even talks about, there's a bit of depression during the end of his life because of the process of change was so slow, and it just pained his soul.
Yeah, and I love this approach that you took in doing this, because it does get at that historical king very well, and most of us, if not all of us, have in mind the popular king, and so you might even think of that as, in terms of different character strengths, but maybe, because a person could take this approach and think about historical figures in this way, looking at the historical person, and that really gives us really interesting insights and insights that we can reach. Whereas if we just pursue the popular Gandhi or Mother Teresa, rather than the historical Gandhi, who he actually was, a historical Mother Teresa, it's much more reachable if we look to the historical. We can emulate, these great figures and from the past by looking at the historical piece. So could you say a little bit, because I know when we talked about King before, there was a lot of vulnerabilities that you shared about him and about Mother Teresa and Gandhi as well. But I think it's fascinating for people to hear this, because that's just another way of kind of grounding this amazing person, but also so that they're somewhat relatable and we could still emulate some of their good qualities. Could you share a little bit about that?
Well, what we talked about earlier, what I share with people is that he was a reluctant leader. He never really wanted to be, he felt that he took the leadership role out of obligation. It wasn't ego, right? He was a very young man. When he first gets to Montgomery in 1955, 56, E.D. Nixon, who's the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association, comes up to him and wants him to lead ministers. But he says, look, I'm from Atlanta. I'm not from Montgomery. And they said, well, that's why we like you, because you're not bought by the city fathers. All the other preachers, Black preachers in that time, were actually owed favors to the city government, and they were kind of bought and paid for. So what they liked King was, first of all, he was smart. He spoke very well. He was very young, and he wasn't beholden to anybody. So they thought that he had a certain type of freedom that most of the people who had born there and grew up there did not have, right? So he represented, and he said, look, if you really want me to do this, I'll do this. But he never anticipated, and think about this. You're talking about a racial minority with population who had no money, right? No weapons, no media. All they did was boycott a bus. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't a corporation, a bus. No one can anticipate that that's going to dismantle the whole system of segregation, right? It's an amazing act. They thought they were just boycotting a bus, right? And the first demands weren't about, we need to have an integrated bus. It was like more of a friendlier form of segregation. They were like, just don't push us around. But when they didn't give up the most modest demands, they said, well, we might as well go for the whole kit and caboodle and like just have the whole thing be desegregated. So the Montgomery bus boycott, which is his first mass action campaign, right, and shot him into the national spotlight, was a success that he could have never anticipated, right? He saw himself as being just a preacher at a middle-class church, and he was going to go there and maybe teach some classes on the side. The fact that he became this national leader was totally unanticipated. He wasn't really ready. He wasn't expecting it, I should say, not ready for it, but he wasn't expecting it. But his personal character was very reluctant and a bit shy, but he felt this kind of conviction, this calling to do this. And that's thrust him into the national spotlight. But I think, my first thing, I thought his first signature trait was going to be humility. Right? I know a lot of people put love there, which is certainly understandable. A lot of people put justice there, which also is understandable. But from my reading of him, he was a deeply humble man who didn't really brag about his ability and really wanted to be a servant to humanity. Right? So, I anticipated, like probably humility as being as part of a signature virtue.
When I love the examples that you gave and just how practical it is, just this practical action that he took. He wasn't out there just trying to change the world, and that's kind of an unreachable thing for us to just say, oh, I'm going to do that too. But he took this practical action that any of us can take too. We can take one step toward positive social action, just like King did. That's when just a side comment about the rest of King's results. We could look at the full profile, his full rank order of strengths, and to look at his raw scores, which we can do at some point, and maybe get back with the community here, because it could be that humility was tied, with number 6 or 7, or there wasn't like a significant raw score difference between those top 5. So we can look more closely at the actual raw scores rather than just the rank order, and that'll actually tell us, because maybe again perseverance, some of these other strengths people are spotting, fairness, are likely very close, but that could be a to be continued point. But could you tell us and set us up a little bit, Adam, on the beloved community? Maybe just a really like one sentence definition. Like when you say beloved community, because I don't know if any of us can define it like you can though. So please define it, like maybe in a sentence, and then set us up for a couple, activities as well.
Yes. Well, it's so interesting you asked the question. Beloved community is more of a metaphor than a definition, right? It's kind of like, for those of who are Christian or the Abrahamic tradition, the kingdom of God, right? How do you define what the kingdom of God is? Well, it's more of a metaphor. It's not, but what King really was doing with the idea of a beloved community, he's really trying to talk about a form of relational bondedness that goes with the term agape love. So what's the social, and that's about God's love. So how is that socially expressed? Well, through beloved community. That is, the bonds between human beings are loving bonds, a loving form of relational bonds. And it's kind of what he imagined to be the historical expression of what the kingdom of God looks like on earth, right? So what I thought would be interesting for us to do on this session today is to really think about how, King came to prominence in the 1950s because he helped people relate to each other creatively and productively across difference, specifically racial difference, right? And since we have so many coaches, educators, change agents, and thought leaders on the line, I really wanted to raise the question, what signature strengths would you use in your personal context to relate to people who are racially and culturally different from yourself, right? How would you what signature strengths would you identify to relate across difference in your personal life, right? And I think that might be, if we can really get at that, I think we might be able to kind of prefigure what King refers to as beloved community.
Excellent. So if you'd like to raise your hand to share aloud how you think you would use your signature strengths to cross different divides, please raise your hand and we'll open up your line. Also, you can feel free to chat. So to offer, and remember, if you do offer something in the chat, to not only say your signature strengths or character strengths that would be necessary, but maybe like a one-sentence example of that use and why you think that strength would be helpful in bridging that divide. So while we're waiting to see if anyone wants to raise their hand, Chris, thanks for starting us off. Chris says curiosity to learn more about the differences.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that too. Taking an approach of kind of inquisitiveness rather than assuming we know about what the other side is thinking, or we know their approach, we know who they are, we know everything about them and their values or whatever, or their opinions, but we start with questions rather than statements. Then Loretta says honesty and perspective. Parveen says gratitude. That's Parveen's top strength for opportunity to learn about the other person. Ruth says appreciative beauty and excellence, seeing that every person is unique and valuable. And Maria says humor to break any tensions, barriers in a gentle way.
And Lisa has a hand up, Ron.
Okay. Yep. Lisa and Leslie. Okay.
Okay. Hi. I have, I think that almost all of my top 5 could be useful, but the one I think is most useful for me, other than the ones that folks have already mentioned, is bravery. Because I'm not afraid to make mistakes and to admit when I've made mistakes. So I tend to just not shy away from having difficult conversations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. That certainly makes sense.
Yeah, I like, bravery is certainly a key feature of the King legacy, right? Like, because he's actually trying to relate across not just difference, but hostile difference, right? Antagonistic difference, right? So it's one thing to just have difference, right? Because we all differ from each other in some way. But when you have antagonistic or hostile difference, it takes a different form of bravery and fortitude to actually relate, right? And one of the things that King always tried to do was he said, look, my goal is not to crush my opponent, right? My goal is to take my enemy into a friend. So he took the very idea of the biblical imperative to love your enemies, right? Very seriously. Like that translated in, most of us kind of, bypass that, right? But he took that real seriously. It really made it a part of the social movement. And I think, in today's world, it's kind of interesting, right? Like, how do we view that in the context of such a divided, and we have so many passions running so high, right? Like, how do you institute that into our contemporary context? Or is it even relevant anymore, right? Like, it might not, some people might say, hey, that's not a part of the King legacy. I prefer to actually embody.
Yeah, bravery seems like such a really a perfect response for thinking about this in a practical way for our own life. And I mean, certainly bravery is about facing adversity, and King faced that in so many different ways. I wonder, Adam, when I think of bravery and facing adversity, there's certainly the external adversity, and you already gave lots of examples of all the threats that he faced, but yet kept going, facing that. But I also wonder about his own inner adversity too. That can block a whole lot of people, their own fears, their own discomforts, and they don't act for one social reason or another. And I don't know if he was one to have a whole lot of inner demons and inner struggles. I mean, you mentioned a couple, like, he had his own insecurities like Gandhi and Mother Teresa did.
Yeah.
Anything else on that?
Oh, that's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up, Ryan, because yes, he was plagued with self-doubt, right? He's actually started, I don't know if people realize, he was only 26 when he started in Montgomery. He was killed at 39, right? So his public life was 12 years. And he was a very young man. And he's usually dealing with people in their 40s and beyond, right, for the most part. And they saw him as a kid. They were like, I remember when some, leaders saw him, they were like, the man is so young. They were just so shocked by how young he looked young when he first started. So he was plagued with self-doubt, and the idea of not knowing, right? So you had a whole team of advisors too. So and that actually speaks to a certain type of humility. And most people who are sincere about actually the spiritual life and the intellectual life know that they don't know, right? So so you're usually kind of what I call brailing yourself through the world, right? Like you can't really see, but you're stepping out on faith. And I think King saw himself being led to this. He saw himself as more like trying to navigate the winds of change, not creating the change. So he had a deep sense of humility about himself and really was trying to use his faith to step out into the world, and saw himself as just, being a channel for forces that are greater than himself.
Such a great point. I know we're going to hear from Leslie in just a second, but just to highlight that point that you just said, it's not like, it sounds like King wasn't necessarily saying, I'm going to be brave and face this adversity. Instead, he was like, not that he said it this way, but I'm going to be true to myself. I'm going to be true to my own signature strengths, my humility, my gratitude, my spirituality, and I'm going to just put that forth strongly in the world. And then the bravery came from that. It's kind of like his signature strengths led him to then be brave, and probably a number of other strengths, which is a different pathway. Other people might take the bravery pathway, but it sounds like for King, it was bravery came because of his other strong qualities. Would that be?
I have a story. I have a story actually that you say that. During the Montgomery bus boycott, after his house had been bombed, and after he got so many threats on the phone that told him to kill himself and calling him a bunch of racial epithets, one time it just got to him. He starts to break down. They call it the kitchen vision. He goes to his knees and starts to pray. He said, God, I don't know if I'm right, but I think I'm right. I think I'm doing the right thing. And then he talks about how he heard God talk about, get up, Martin, be true to what you believe and that type of thing. And he starts to really hear it. He starts to preach himself kind of happy, but he has kind of a breakdown to break through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's kind of like a shedding of the self and a remaking of the self, right? In the same thing. And I think that's where the kind of bravery and courage comes in, that fortitude, because they had a moment of just radical self-doubt. Like, what am I doing? My children could be killed. And this is just for, and mind you, this is not his, his home per se. He'd only been there for a few months. So imagine you coming to a new city and people bombing your family, right? You might want to go back to your old job, right? Right? Why am I, this is not my fight. My people are not here. But he sat there and he really had this deep sense of calling, a deep sense of commitment to the mission. And he heard God speak to him, and that strengthened and fortified him.
Yeah, beautiful story. I really appreciate you sharing that. Well, let's check in with Leslie here. So Leslie, you can unmute your line, or Ruth can. There we go.
Thank you, Ryan. Hi, Adam. Thank you so much for being here. Gosh, I just get excited. So excuse the goofy grin, because I went to Howard University and I read a lot about Martin Luther King and Jr. And I also live in California, and I'm sure you know the leader, what's his name? The guy that's over the Martin Luther King Institute at Stanford.
Oh, Claiborne Carson.
Yeah, Carson. Yeah. So my point being, this just hits home for me. I'll just tell you real quickly, when I was in a busing project, believe it or not, in the early 70s in Baltimore, I was assaulted by a white girl that was pushing the lockers. I almost died because the part of the lock went into my back. Point being, I was thinking, as I learned about character strengths more recently in my life, that, boy, wonder what strength would supersede all the others, even if the test said that they were different strengths in terms of what I was feeling around what happened to me. Some people say, oh, you were a brave little girl. But really, like with Martin Luther King, it wasn't about bravery. The way I see it, bravery is more about self-sufficiency. So I would see the character strengths that would loom really large in how I can walk in what Dr. King's legacy is, would be forgiveness and honesty. Because I know I had to live that a lot. I had a choice as a young girl to say, all white people are bad because of what happened to me. But my mother knew differently. And she said to me, I don't want you to go through life thinking that all white people are like that girl that pushed you in the lockers. You can't do that. That will not help you grow. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm saying that with regard to Martin Luther King, because he believed in accepting people as they were. But the thing is, as an African-American today, to have some of the beliefs I do, I have more hate against me, even by some other African-Americans. You follow what I mean? Where King would sit down and listen to you, even if he disagreed. I don't find that as often generally, particularly with the height of everything right now. And I think that would sadden him. That's just my thought. Because I think he believed in coming from a forgiving edge, because he realized it wasn't about him. It was about who he was following, who was gone.
Yeah, no, that's a profound question. That's a profound, it's interesting now that you say that. It's helped me clarify. I struggle with the term forgiveness because I was trying to make a distinction between how he operated in his personal life versus his social vision, right? Like in terms of that, certainly in his social vision, I can speak more directly to that because that's a matter of public record. Forgiveness was prominent. Love and forgiveness and nonviolent were very prominent, but forgiveness wasn't forgive and forget. And I think that was one of the questions. It was more about forgive and repair, right? It wasn't forgetfulness. It was like kind of forgiveness is more like I release the bitterness that I have towards you, right? But you still have to correct, right? You still have to correct the wrong that you've done, right? So that forgiveness wasn't about just kind of letting things stay. He thought that a reparative job had to be done to actually right the wrong that you actually did. right? That was actually done. So I know that in his social vision, that's what he believed. And I'll give you an example. He talks about that. He talks about the GI Bill created the white middle class, right? Like when white people came back from World War II and couldn't get back on their feet because of the country, the GI Bill helped so many veterans enter into the middle class with home ownership and good jobs and that type of thing. He says, but Black people have been enslaved for 246 years, Jim Crow for 100 years, and no type of GI Bill. We need a GI Bill for the Negro, right? So on one hand, he wanted to actually lessen racial hostilities between Black and white people, but he still thought there needed to be some type of repair. He said if the government caused a problem, it has to actually be part of the solution of repairing the problem it caused in the first place, right? So it wasn't a forgetfulness, it was actually a repair in terms of that. So that was his social vision. In terms of his personal life, you know, I'm agnostic. I really don't know, and I haven't seen too many things in terms of people personally wronged him, in terms of people who were in horizontal proximity to him, right? Like in terms of, I don't know how he operated with his friends. And did he, you know, I imagine that he wasn't a person who held on to grievances for an undue long piece of time and just was bitter toward people who were his, you know, interpersonal enemies, you know, in terms of that. Or it doesn't even seem like he had it, that type of thing. But there's just not enough evidence to say that. But I know his social vision, he had that.
I just want to thank you for that, Adam, for that great response. And thank you, Leslie, for your story and for your sharing there. And a bow to your mom and her wisdom, and a bow to you as well for following her wisdom and for sharing with us. And I just want to make a point in the chat. There's more people who have been sharing what they would do practically to overcome different barriers and divides. Bobby says humility, being open-minded and really listening to understand where the other person's coming from and creating a safe space where they feel comfortable communicating openly. Catherine reminds us of Martin Luther King quote on love. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Stephanie adds curiosity and love of learning to help find shared beliefs. Lots of different things here. Patience, love of learning, many other great insights. But I wonder, I know we have a little bit more time, Adam, and you had another really awesome activity to offer all of us. Another one that really brings things home. So maybe you can, and I know this is a little bit going to be a little bit United States centric, but of course this can apply to other countries as well. So would you mind setting that up and asking people what you would invite them to do? And we'll probably turn to the chat for this one, just so we can hear as many people as possible and manage the time.
Okay, well, here's a second question I had. In the United States, we're in the midst of a very divisive electoral season, where passions are inflamed on both sides, right? And people are not hearing or talking, they're talking past each other and they're not hearing each other. As I mentioned before, King took the biblical imperative, love your enemies, very seriously. Gandhi warned we shouldn't become the evil we oppose. That is, we shouldn't ape or imitate, I should say, the very tactics of the people that we oppose. And in light of that, you know, especially the United States, but not limited to it, the question I have is, what signature strengths would you use to speak to a person who votes for a candidate that you despise? You know, what signature strength would you use to speak with a person who votes for a candidate that you despise?
And again, if you wouldn't mind, please sharing the strength, and then if there's like a little phrase or a quick, you know, one sentence example to go with it to help us understand why you say that strength or how you would use it. We've got a couple
and punching someone in the mouth is not a character strength.
That's not, no. Even if it's somebody's desire, that's not not the optimal approach. So we have Paul getting us started here with prudence, and then he adds judgment or discernment. Claudia offers open-mindedness, which is the judgment strength. Francis says curiosity, trying to understand where they're coming from without judgment. Jane says self-regulation. Lord says spirituality, freedom of choice, respect. Elizabeth says judgment, examining positions from all sides. Lisa turns to love, and that's the one that she turns to with different family members. Chris says social intelligence, trying to understand their motives and the different social situations. So it seems like, Adam, a lot of people are kind of mentioning different character strengths to get at that pathway of understanding the other and understanding their perspective.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I wanted to raise this question is because these are the type of strengths that I anticipate we're going to need both pre-election and post-election, right? Like if you're situated in the United States, there's a very danger in the kind of unweaving of the very fabric of democracy that's happening right now. That democracies are based on trust, public trust of your fellow human being and neighbor, right? That's the very basis of democracy. If we don't have trust, if we don't have confidence, even in people that we despise, then we really don't have much of a democracy. So if we're going to keep this experiment going, we're going to need these in abundance. And since I have so many, change agents on this call, I wanted to collectively reflect on things we could do to actually be part of the solution and not add to the deepening of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what do you think about these change agents' character strengths that they're suggesting here? Some of the ones we mentioned, also humor, humility, self-control,
That's an
climate.
interesting one.
Go ahead, what's that?
I also saw a lot of curiosity at the beginning. It's kind of, and I think that's what I would probably think. Like, I'm just curious. Like, I really don't understand. Like, what do you find so compelling? Like, and that's probably what, personally, that's what I'm probably more apt to lead with in terms of that. I'm always curious of how people's minds work and why they feel someone is compelling that I find to be despicable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what works for you in this?
So then what would you suggest? So like if it starts like with curiosity, let's say, curiosity, or some people calling it maybe social intelligence or judgment, critical thinking, but they're kind of trying to get the same flavor. If it starts with that, then what would be step two? Not that there's exact steps in this, but if you, after that, then what do you do? Because you can't just be curious forever. I mean, so then what happens next?
After I hear their explanation, I'll see if it resonates with me. If something resonates, or if there's something that feels, because I guess what happens, especially if someone you despise, you tend to, it's hard to have a rational conversation, right? Like if someone you find to be absolutely evil and someone else admires that person, you tend to project the same type of motives onto the person, right? Which may or may not be the case, right? So I guess the thing is like, can you see it from their perspective, right? Can you see it? Can you inhabit their subjectivity and see the world through their eyes? Right. And generally in a democracy, we're supposed to actually engage our fellow citizens and try to use the persuasive arguments to try to say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this way? But what about, that kind of thing. So I'm really trying to talk about how to have a informed, right, and civil type of, but rigorous conversation in a way that we're just not projecting onto each other, and we're really genuinely hearing each other. So this gets to the quality of our listening, right? Not necessarily that you're going to start to agree with the person, but can we have quality listening toward each other?
Well, what do you think King would say? I mean, maybe very similar to what you said, so if there's anything different, but what else would he add if he was alive today and interacting right now and trying to offer wisdom to both sides, say, or to the American people and to other countries as well? What would be his key messages?
Yeah, it's hard to speak for him, but I think he'd be heartbroken. I think he'd be heartbroken at the lack of progress, and maybe a bit dismayed Um, but, I think he would say that, democracies and countries are not fixed entities, they're malleable entities, right? They're capable of both growth and decay. And I think by some way he tried to be part of the growing edge of America and not the decay of America, right? So I think he tried to organize, a group of folks and be the leaven of the country, right? That helps rise and really encourage people. I heard someone say, it's not about winning the battle, it's about being above the battle, right? And I think he tried to actually have what we used to call statesmanship, right? In terms of that, and tried to encourage people or higher ground, right? Let's try to occupy a moral center, right, where we could actually call people toward, right? And I think that's what he would do. He would try to call America to her highest possibilities and encourage people to follow that pathway.
Mm-hmm.
Sonia has her hand up.
Oh, hi. Is my microphone on now? Oh, okay.
Yep.
First of all, just thank you so much for your comments. There's just so much to think about here. But one of the things that my mind keeps going back to, at the very beginning of your comments, you talked about this, the difference between the historical king and the popular king. And one of the things that my mind keeps going back to is this idea, well, you mentioned that people at opposite ends of the political spectrum still embrace the popular king. And it occurred to me that you took the strengths assessment from the perspective of the historical king, but I wonder if indeed, when we think about the popular king, if a different set of signature strengths would be emphasized. And I think particularly some people focus on the love and forgiveness and maybe ignore the pursuit of justice and fairness. And so there might even be this tension between the signature strengths that different parts of the population choose to focus on in King, which I think is interesting.
No, I think you're spot on with that. I think you're right. Yeah, the popular king probably would be love, forgiveness, and those type of social values and virtues that he actually used for the movement.
That make him seem very kind and nice, right?
Yes. Now that wasn't just like all of you guys. You guys have a professional life and you have a personal life, right? They overlap, but they're not identical, in terms of that. I think the king the same way, that we know him in his professional kind of as a public life. His personal life, it wasn't identical to that. So he would look differently to his friends than he would to the kind of to people who heroize and lionize in terms of him. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I totally agree.
And then Adam, to bring back that third king that you mentioned, the living king, what might you kind of leave all of us with here of maybe one, so the living king you defined as using Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy to create a new future. So if you were to offer kind of our community here of one strategy, one step to one key point to walk away with toward the living king, what practically would you offer us?
Wow, that's a great question. That's a great question. I think, as all legacies, the King legacy is I see it as dynamic, and it can be applied, and has been applied to so many different, everything from racial justice to ecological justice to LGBTQ struggles, to all people who have, marginalized identities. So to me, I think the signature virtue in terms of promoting King's legacy is creativity, I would say. How can we enact creative transformation in light of King's legacy? In his lifetime, he stressed, he was really working on three things. One was the racial justice issue, right? That was an early ministry. In the middle of his life, he started turning to poverty economics. And by the end of his life, he's working on militarism in terms of violence. He called those the triplets of evil: race, poverty, and militarism, right? And we can expand that to the ecology. The key question is, who is your neighbor, right? The neighbor used to be like kind of just a person that looks like you. Now we have, as evidenced by this call, this community, global neighbors, right? So we have to expand our moral scope beyond people we live face to face with and look globally. And also we have to look at our non-human neighbors, right? The environment, the plants, creation as our neighbor. So I think in terms of to creatively, that King would not have us just freeze him in 1968 when he was assassinated. He would want us to take his vision and creatively apply it to our problems for today. It's no longer morally courageous to be against the buffoonery of a Bull Connor or a Jim Clark who are actually beating, sicking dogs on Black people. But now we have to struggle against the assumptions that undermine our contemporary culture, the assumptions that actually keep people locked into limiting views and visions of themselves. And I would think that he would want us to creatively expand his legacy so we could have maximum human flourishing and a just creation.
Beautifully said. What a great point to conclude on. And when actually, if you don't mind, if we can conclude actually with a couple quotes. And the quotes are from Professor Adam Clark. So these quotes actually come from an article I would recommend everybody to read that Adam wrote for the Cincinnati Enquirer. So just type Adam Clark in Cincinnati Enquirer, and you'll see his piece. I will also post it in the Facebook group for United in Strengths. And I couldn't choose one, Adam. I'm sorry. So you guys have to bear with a couple of them here. So let's see. One quote you said was from King, what kind of democracy are we trying to become? Just and inclusive, or tribal and restrictive? And another thing from you on the beloved community. The beloved community is both within and before us. It sounds a lot like kind of Gospel of Thomas from Jesus, but beloved community is both within and before us. And with this awareness, we are challenged to be able to hew out stones of hope from mountains of despair. That's beautiful. And one more, perfect conclusion, I think. King saw a hidden wholeness beneath the brokenness and division in human life. He didn't see our choices as being between Black versus white, Republican versus Democrat, gay versus straight. For him, the choice was clear: chaos or community. We can live together as brothers and sisters, or perish together as fools.
Amen.
So with that,
amen.
Well, amen to you and to King, and we're clapping for you, Adam. Thank you. A bow of gratitude to you, from me, from Ruth, from Via, from the whole United in Strengths community, from probably, 20, 30 countries around the world. We deeply appreciate your wisdom, your sharing, your honesty, your character, your compassion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it.